Our next poem in the paper Post-Colonial Writings is A.D. Hope's Australia. A.D. Hope is a famous Australian poet. He was highly educated, unlike his contemporary Jack Davis, who also wrote a poem on Australia, Aboriginal Australia, the last poem we studied. Immediately, we can draw a line of comparison between the two. Jack Davis is a representative of the tribal Australia, the Aboriginal Australia. He belonged to the Noongar tribe, and he spent much of his life in making his people visible to the world outside. Uh, Jack Davis, in fact, was really involved in Aboriginal politics, right? Uh, A.D. Hope is an academician. He had his post-graduation from Oxford University, later came back to Australia and became an English professor in Sydney University. So he had that kind of an academic background, and he wrote this poem, Australia, in somewhat an ambiguous manner, which led to many kind of misinterpretations of the poem, I should say. I had seen people, in fact, interpreting this poem in different ways. The lines also, in fact, prompts people to have different interpretations. But in order to understand the real meaning of this poem, we have to get an idea about the real attitude, approach, the mindset of the poet A.D. Hope. We can get an inner vision on the psyche or the mindset of the poet by reading some other poems written by him. The poem and another poem written by A.D. Hope, Standardization, gives us a fairly good idea about the attitude of A.D. Hope towards the so-called progress made by the white government in Australia, what involved in the process of modernization of the land. Okay. We can read line by line. A nation of trees, drab green and desolate grey, in the field uniform of modern wars, darkens her hills, those endless outstretched paws of sphinx, demolished or stone lion away. Nation of trees, drab green and desolate grey. The Australia was looked upon by the poet A.D. Hope, not with much of enthusiasm. The geography or the nature of Australia was not looked upon with great enthusiasm by the poet. Nation of trees, drab green and desolate grey, suggests that dullness in the field uniform of modern wars. A.D. Hope was born in 1907 and he wrote this poem in 1951, the post-war period. But I don't think the modern wars mentioned here is the Second World War or so. In fact, Australia, there were certain civil wars. We cannot call it civil wars as such. We can call a civil war only if two sides fight a fierce battle between them. But in Australia, it was a one-sided battle. The white government, the English government there tried their level best to wipe out the Aboriginal culture of Australia. The many mass massacres took place there. So the biodiversity of the land was somewhat destroyed by this government, the foreign government, the alien government, in their eagerness to set up a modernized society which could be a colony of England. So that loss of biodiversity made all parts of Australia look almost alike because of the civil wars. And there is a mention of the Sphinx in the same stanza. Sphinx in Greek and Egyptian mythology stand for a creature half man and half lion. The Egyptians make use of this figure Sphinx for ancient wisdom. In the famous drama by Bernard Shaw, Antony and Cleopatra, Caesar and Cleopatra, I should say. Cleopatra hides behind the statue of Sphinx when Caesar comes for the very first time or so. Sphinx stands for ancient wisdom, So by wiping out the Aboriginal culture, the English government deprived Australia the ancient wisdom of the Aboriginals, which could be traced back to some 1,000 or more years, They call her a young country, but they lie. She is the last of the lands, the emptiest. A woman beyond her age of life, a breast still tender, but within the womb is dry. They means the foreigners, the people, the rulers also, people from England, to be precise. They call Australia a young country. The reason why they do so, because Australia was discovered by Captain Cook only in the 18th century, in 1770. That might be the reason why they call Australia a young country, but they lie. Australia is not a young country. Australia was young only to the outsiders. The Aboriginals living in Australia at the time Captain Cook discovered this place had a very rich culture and civilization which could be traced back to thousands of years, So it would be a lie to call Australia a young nation. A woman beyond her change of life, a breast still tender but within the womb dry. As a result of the demolition of the Aboriginal culture, Australia now looks like a woman who has attained her menopause, a woman in her who is into the middle age or more advanced middle age or so, because she could sustain the life of the people. She could her change breast is still tender. She could feed the people, but at the same time she lacks the creativity. Because of the demolition of the Aboriginal culture, the creativity of the land was lost. That is the reason why he says the womb is dry. There is no creation. There is no creativity for the land as a result of the demolition of the rich ancient culture. Without songs, architecture and history, the emotions and superstitions of younger lands, her rivers of water drawn among the inland sands, the rivers of her immense stupidity. So as a result of that bid by the foreign people, the English people who formed the government in Australia, they didn't have any songs, architecture or history of their own. They had, in fact, but unfortunately all these were taken away from them in a conscious bid to destroy the Aboriginal culture of Australia. They destroyed the songs, architecture and history of the land, the emotions and superstitions of younger lands. They were living a life very close to nature, So they had what we call intrapersonal communication, transpersonal communication, intuitive knowledge. People who live in close physical proximity with nature, the tribal people in Amazon forest and others, they develop such kinds of what we call the sixth sense or so, Tribal people used to be very rich in such kind of transnational culture also. I should say, in fact, sixth sense or so, intuitive power also, Unfortunately, such kind of prowess of the tribal people were misunderstood by the people and misunderstood by other people, and they call it superstition. So this country now don't have emotion or superstition of their own. Floods the river of her immense stupidity, floods her monotonous tribes from Cairns to Perth. In them at last the ultimate men arrive, whose boast is not we live but we survive, a type who will inhabit the dying earth. The river of her immense stupidity. In fact, the river could be called the cradle of civilization. Most of the great civilizations we find in the world were by the sides of the river, whether it be Indus Valley civilization, Babylonian civilization, or the Egyptian civilization on the banks of River Nile. Unfortunately, these aboriginals lost out to the colonizers. So that is the reason why he calls them rivers of stupidity. They were foolish enough to surrender all their advantages to the uh, colonizers. Floods curve monotonous tribes from Cairns to Perth. Perth, of course, situates in Western Australia. Cairns should be on the other side. So, through the length and breadth of the country, these rivers, in fact, feed or floods the monotonous tribe. There could be an irony used in this line, monotonous tribe. In fact, these people tend to the white people, the colonial masters tend to call the tribe as monotonous people, but they hardly recognize the tribal culture. That is the reason why they are called so. The tribal culture could be having infinite variety. If you read The Land of Capiris, written by S.K. Pottekkatt, you can find how different cultures could be seen even in the distance of some 5 kilometers or so. S.K. Pottekkatt was taken by surprise when he finds an entirely different kind of culture when he moves around 5 kilometers or so. Even though the tribes might the tribes might be looking like almost similar for the foreigners, So likewise, the foreign colonial masters must have misunderstood that the tribals in Australia could be rather monotonous. But here the term is used in an ironical way. Who is really monotonous? It is the European masters who happen to be monotonous without having any variety, biodiversity or anything like that, But they point an accusing finger at the tribal community, calling them monotonous. In fact, they are very rich and they have the rich variety. In the last poem, Aboriginal Australia, we in fact studied of the Murray tribe, the Warare tribe. They are different from one another, right? And these intruders, the colonizers, they could only survive. They could not say we live, because they didn't have that kind of the cultural background. And her 5 cities, like 5 teeming souls, each drains her a vast parasite robber state where second-hand Europeans pullulate timidly on the edge of alien shores. And her 5 cities, like 5 teeming souls. Australia, we can find 5 big cities in Australia: Sydney, Perth, Melbourne, then Canberra, maybe Australia's capital city, Adelaide. There are cities, So the European masters, the English masters, the colonial forces, they were rather very particular to build a modernized Australia, something very similar to their mother country, England, and to make Australia a colonial province of theirs, which might be very, very useful for them. Okay, so in their bid to make Australia to their advantage, in order to rebuild Australia to their advantage, they built big cities. But these big cities now appear like big wounds in the psyche and physique of Australia, because in order to build these big cities, they flattened the rich biodiversity variety of Australia, So Australia was a vast land having quite a lot of agricultural variety, quite a lot of richness in the tribal culture. All these were wiped out, and they just built the big cities to model itself on England, So these 5 cities now stand as big wounds on the Australian psyche and physique. In fact, we can find a similar situation here in India. Mahatma Gandhi was for cottage industry to make the rural India thrive with the activities. He, in fact, said that the soul of India could be found only in rural villages, and he wanted to have cottage industry be given more prominence in order to make India economically rich nation, something like what Japan did after the Second World War, But Nehru was an imitator of the Western style of life, and he wanted to make big cities. He wanted to make India industrialized, and most of the money from the 5-year plans were squandered on the big cities like Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, right? And maybe one of the reasons for the backwardness of India, one of the reasons for the slow progress of India after our independence, So likewise, these colonial masters built big cities in the name of modernization, and as a result, the rural Australia suffered terribly. Okay, so now the cities stand like the wounds on the Australian physique and psyche, I should say. And what is Australia after all? The second-hand Europeans palliate. Palliate means just going on living without doing anything creatively, just eat, drink, and walk around, right? Timidly on their these Europeans, England sent their second-hand citizens to Australia, the criminals and the prisoners, along with that governor, the first governor, I just forgot his name. They sent some missionaries and military forces along with him to conquer Australia and to make it a colonial country under them, right? Yet there are some like me turn gladly home from the lush jungle of modern thought to find Arabian desert to the human mind, hoping it's still from the desert the prophets come, But when many people in fact pretend themselves as moderners, the poet of course wants to take a different view, He doesn't stand with the so-called moderners, and he thinks that the rural Australia, the Aboriginal Australia still had something more to offer, in fact, like a prophet emerged from the Arabian deserts I think in the 5th century AD or so. The last prophet must have been emerged from the deserts of Arabia. Likewise, he thinks the next philosopher or prophet who might change the course of the life of people all over the world might come from one of these rural parts of Australia, maybe from the Aboriginal tribe. A prophet may arise all of a sudden because the tribal people are rich with the ancient wisdom, unlike the European masters who could be rather monotonous in their thought process and all such, He thinks that there is a possibility for a prophet to emerge from the Aboriginal culture, and right. Unfortunately, the lush jungle of modern thought, people think that they are highly modern. The colonial people think that they are really modern, but in fact they are the barbarians, They are less civilized. If they are civilized, they might never in fact colonize others, They will never in fact torture others in the name of colonization. So that means they are not civilized enough, but they think that they are modernized and civilized and look upon the original people of Australia with a lot of disdain and scorn, right? Such a savage and scarlet as no green hills dare springs in the waste, some spirit which escapes the learned doubt, the chatter of cultured apes, which is called civilization over there, So he is hopeful of something of a revolutionary change to emerge from the savage scarlet side of Australia, So there is the wild Australia. In the rural Australia still happens to be very wild, having the bright colors and all such. So there is a possibility that there will be a new spring emerging from such a part of Australia, right? Just like Mao Zedong said, right? a new spring will be emerged from this interior part of Australia by making use of the ancient wisdom which escapes the learned doubt, the chatter of cultured apes, which is called civilization. So in the last part of the poem, he in fact makes use of very strong words, cultured apes. Who are called cultured apes? The colonial masters, the Europeans, his own breed of people, the whites, are called the cultured apes, which is called civilization over there. So here there is a strong sense of sarcasm in the when it comes to the last few lines of the poem. He calls his own people, the white people, cultured apes, the monkeys who in fact pretends themselves as civilized and cultured, and they in fact mistake this for civilization. This kind of modernization of the land, building bricks by brick, making skyscrapers or so, they mistake this for development, this for modernization, right? And they think that this kind of material progress they could see around them could be the modernization. And these people, the colonial masters, were not better than cultured apes. In fact, that was a retaliation on the part of the poet. They called the aboriginals not better than monkeys, grinning and chattering monkeys. That is how they called the colonizers. That is how they called the aboriginals. But in fact, the poet makes an emphatic statement at the end of the poem, saying that they are the people they are the people far inferior to the rich aboriginal tribes, and they are called cultured monkeys, I should say. And what they consider as civilization is not the real civilization, right? It is nothing but barbarism which they made use of for the conquest of the Aboriginal culture. No civilized man would do such heinous acts of crime. That is the logic behind such strong words used by A.D. Hope. When A.D. Hope writes so, it becomes even greater, because unlike Jack Davis, he doesn't have any personal involvement in the in fact, he doesn't identify himself with this aboriginal man. So even from that alien distance, even from that distance, he in fact speaks for the aboriginal Australia even in a stronger tone than Jack Davis. Okay.